I ended up plumbing the depths of the darkness of myself and then managed to emerge on the other side, a transformed human being. And so sometimes plumbing the nadir of life has given me now the gift to experience the zenith or the apex of heaven.
Today's guest is Todd Youngs, an addiction and integration specialist whose own experiences with psychedelics helped him finally break free from addiction. Today, Todd has discovered the joy of sober living and helps others find hope, healing, and the belief that recovery is possible.
Welcome to the Human Journeys podcast by States of Mind. Real people, real stories, life-changing conversations of personal growth and healing.
Hey, Todd. Welcome to the Human Journeys podcast.
It's my pleasure to be here, Jason.
Right. So this is the Human Journeys podcast, and you definitely have one. Would you like to introduce your story to the audience?
To put my life journey into a sort of a Cliff Notes version, that I came into the world as a curious human being. I ended up plumbing the depths of the darkness of myself and then managed to emerge on the other side, a transformed human being. And so sometimes plumbing the nadir of life has given me now the gift to experience
The zenith.
the zenith or the apex of heaven. So
Hmm.
going from the nadir of hell to the zenith of heaven has been quite, I use the language sometimes, a spiritual journey, that all human beings are kind of like, we come into this world and we have our own journey. And for me, I characterize it now, looking back these last 59 years, as being an extraordinary adventure of discovery and transformation. And yeah.
Okay. Solid intro. I like it. Uh, so, uh, hmm. So addiction journey is your story.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, however you feel like describing that. From what I heard, your road was rocky, and
It,
you've been through it all.
it was rocky. It was mostly by self created. I chose the road less traveled, but I chose it willingly, and it became rocky. But something I mentioned a couple of years ago on a podcast that just came to me while I was sharing then, which I can share again now, is that as I mentioned just a minute ago, I came into the world as a really curious human being. That I was born to loving parents, 1967. I was born in Germany. My parents were school teachers for the American Department of Defense. Um, so I had loving parents, loving extended family. I had a very profound, innate sense of curiosity. And what I had said, what I've said in other occasions, is that my parents might have done well to put the maxim "curiosity can kill the cat" above my crib, because what was going to guide me henceforth from then was this enormous, adventurous curiosity that took me into all sorts of places. I want to say, though, curiosity is a wonderful quality to have, right? So whether I came to love books, I came to love music, I came to love sports, but I came to love altered states of consciousness.
Right.
And so one could say I had maybe a genetic predisposition to vulnerabilities to chemicals. There's enough evidence to suggest that there's a strong genetic contribution on that. But whatever it is, that my personality structure was such that as soon as I was old enough, I began using chemicals to alter my state of consciousness, my experience of life. It's also important to maybe note, because this will be relevant later, is that I was also a very, and sort of a born agnostic. I didn't believe in Santa Claus by the time I was 4. So, it kinda gives you an idea of how my curious mind worked. I was always asking questions, um, not closing the doors, but always, probing and evaluating. So, like many people in high school, I started out, yeah, smoking some weed, taking some acid trips. This would have been in the mid '80s, and or early '80s, and then critical juncture for me came in 1985, where I discovered that I really liked cocaine, and it was very prevalent in the United States, especially by the mid '80s. There was a lot of really high quality cocaine just sort of flooding into the United States, and I found out that I really liked it, and then I found out I really liked smoking crack, which was also in 1985. And then I found out that I loved using cocaine intravenously. But, but along with cocaine, especially intravenous use, comes a lot of, there's a lot of discomfort with it, a lot of anxious, cravey type of behavior that I also discovered was, could be addressed by using heroin with cocaine. So, this was my
Mhm.
introduction
Uh-huh.
to what we called then, and we still do, call a speedball, mixing
Mm.
heroin with cocaine and using it intravenously.
The classic
Eh
drugs, the slippery slope, the gateway into the slippery slope. Should we use those
well,
cliches?
I mean, you could call it that. It wasn't even a s this wa this wasn't even a slope, I just fell off a cliff. I
Mm,
I went right from recreational drugs like smoking marijuana and maybe taking some acid trips to injecting mixtures of cocaine and heroin. Yeah, I fell right into the depths, and it was also during that time that I did start using crystal meth, but so I had exposure to that too, but my real love was, cocaine and heroin. Unsurprisingly, developing a relationship with those compounds was not going to end well, and, and it didn't. I kinda set the trajectory of my life was set there. It was a few years later that I developed kind of a very severe form of alcoholism, developed what, an increasing sensitivity to the presence of alcohol. But that didn't set in right away. So I don't wanna get too far ahead of myself, but
Yeah.
so there it is, mid-80s, I developed deep relationships with very powerfully addictive drugs. And that kind of created the template for the rest for 20 plus years after that. Now, by some good fortune, I went to college somehow during a little bit of that period, maybe until 1987. I didn't, it was kind of middling grades because I was trying to juggle the dark world that I lived in of hard drug addiction, selling psychedelic drugs in the hippie world that I inhabited to pay for hard drugs. And so I was trying to make sense out of these disparate currents and threads in my life. On one hand, I was trying to live a life of, peace and love and the other virtues that were
mm,
held so highly in the counterculture, but at the same time, being a drug addict, I was intensely self-centered because no matter what kind of, um, high-minded ideals I may have had, the fact was every day when I woke up, getting and using heroin was the most important thing in my life
mm,
because nothing else could happen until
mm.
that need was
Yeah.
satisfied. So,
I guess
anyway,
right.
I don't wanna
Yeah.
ramble too long, but this is kind of was characteristic of my life for 20 years, starting in the mid '80s.
Mm, mhm. So, a natural curiosity led you to explore, and exploration led to maybe a discovery of a physical addiction or just a general addiction, and it dominated your life all the way till you're almost into your 40s, into your till you're 50?
Until I was 42. In
Mm,
2009, was when that's when I got sober. That's the
okay.
term I use for it. So, I mean, strictly speaking, May 9th, 2009 is what we would call in recovery my recovery community, that's my sobriety date.
Mm, right.
Um, in
That's
that ensuing years, I was incarcerated different I went to jail at least, I don't know, 12, 15 different times, did a stint in prison, went to treatment centers, was on methadone programs, saw counselors, lost my teeth, half my teeth anyway, lost close friends, collapsed veins, the entire litany of attendant miseries that go along with, hardcore addiction were visited upon me.
mm,
And in the course of that too, a lot of that was, you know, it was traumatizing.
uh-huh, of
But here
course.
again, I didn't come into addiction as a good portion of people come into addiction as a result of trauma that preceded it.
Mhm,
In my case, that was not true. My the difficult, traumatizing, experiences I had came as a result of addiction, which then did help sustain the addiction. There there's this sense of guilt, shame, remorse, regret, putting oneself in harm's way, blowing up potentially beautiful romantic relationships because the core of my being was driven by these like spiritual gremlins, whether that was, heroin, alcohol, cocaine, and all sorts of other unhealthy behaviors. And so I almost think of those things, I don't want to overly personify them, but they're almost like sentient entities that had sort of commandeered my life. They had certainly, from a neurochemical point of view, had hijacked my brain's reward system and um, but also in a spiritual way, they kind of had commandeered, my life
yeah,
and left me in a state of profound powerlessness and despair. Anyway,
yeah, yeah, there's so much there. Uh, yeah, I guess a thought that I had is, I mean, you mentioned earlier on how addiction is a very self-centered and ego-driven thing. It's the only thing you can think of, and uh, that was something that stuck out. And then I guess you've been through the whole gamut. Someone seen it from the outside. You've experienced it all from this term, and I've only seen it from the outside. So, um, I guess I will say, first of all, congratulations. I guess it's been how long now? 2009,
17 years.
17 years.
Yeah,
And
it's quite miraculous, really, if I can use that word.
yeah, I mean, yeah, you've been through it all. I mean, there's been, I mean, jail and physical deterioration and the deterioration of your relationships and your family. And you mentioned that about maybe you didn't enter addiction, you didn't get led to it because of existing trauma, but then you
Mhm.
create something within you that needs that, the shame and the guilt, and then you're kind of creating conditions where the addiction kind of grows with what you've created. And I don't know what it's like, although there's the I do know what it's like in everyday life. Sometimes you could feel yourself slipping away from yourself, or a mental health condition, or it can be minor, and all of a sudden life seems too overwhelming. And how do so how can relate to your story in very similar ways? Maybe yours has some more extreme milestones along the way than the average person, but it's like the human condition, just what
Yes,
yeah.
right. The human condition is one of great beauty, but also great suffering,
Mhm.
right? And it's sort of like in Buddhism, they talk about the first noble truth is that life is suffering.
Yeah.
But which is not fatal, not to be understood as fatalistic, because the rest of that particular spiritual tradition and path is that there is a solution to how we experience that. And so I have found that within, in Buddhist terms, it would be practicing the Eightfold Noble Path is how we overcome the bondage of that pervasive suffering that characterizes life. And so um yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, uh, we can go down the Buddhist track. I like that you brought that in there, and maybe that'll probably tie in eventually to like your perspectives now on things. Uh, but
Oh, and
I
how I
guess,
and how I and
yeah,
how I broke f well, what freed me from the prison that I had built around myself, right? And I think
hmm,
I think when, it was first suggested that I sit for this podcast, there's a strong psychedelic component to
yeah,
how I was freed from the prison.
yeah. We haven't got there yet. I mean, this
But
states of
there was,
mind. Yeah,
yeah, right.
states of mind is a
We're
psychedelic. Yeah, yeah. So definitely. So eventually, we'll get to the climax. Is ayahuasca came into your life.
right. Well, that was the shift.
Mm,
Going back to 2009, it, I don't know necessarily if it was the climax, but it was certainly the end of my old life and the beginning of my new life. If we think of like rebirth, to borrow a Christian term, you know, the end of my old life and then the beginning of the new, what sat at the intersection there was some very serendipitously experienced ayahuasca ceremonies.
uh,
And
uh-huh.
that was, yeah, that was a pivotal time.
Right. So would you credit psychedelics? Would you credit ayahuasca for the shift? I mean, you did it all. You did 12 step, you did AA, you did classic therapy, rehab, jail, prison. I mean, all the things. I'm sure you were trying to get clean. I'm sure it was kind of you probably went in cycles, of some progress and then some regress, and then there was a shift. And I don't know, do we want to credit it all to psych? I mean, part credit goes to you and your work and you're persevering, but the shift happened after with psychedelics?
Y oh, yeah. I mean, let me one way that I have come to prefer to phrase this or language this is that for me, ayahuasca was like an engine and the 12 steps were a transmission.
Mhm.
And that was the vehicle of my transformation. It took both. Honestly, before 2009, I never really made a wholehearted attempt to change. I wanted the suffering of addiction to lessen. I always wished I could drink like a normal person. But we've been talking about drugs, but my alcohol use disorder, the preferred phrase these days, was so ugly that family members preferred me to simply be using heroin as to be drinking alcohol. So I was literally at this sort of Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde kind of alcoholic. I wanted to be able to learn to drink like a gentleman, and I couldn't. I wanted to be able to use drugs without breaking the bank, without putting myself in precarious situations constantly, but I couldn't. So any attempt previous to 2009 was really half-hearted, kinda like, "Oh, I was in trouble with the law, so the judge told me I had to go to recovery meetings," or, "I had to go to treatment center because I was mandated by the court to go." One time did I go of my own accord. That is true. It would have been in the summer of 2004. I willingly went and signed up for a treatment center and managed to get kicked out. But long story, I don't want to spend too much time on that, but I
Right.
did actually willingly sign up for that one.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it was because part of my I suppose the pervasiveness of my dependencies was that I couldn't really imagine life without these substances. I loved them. I was, you sometimes you hear the language, it's sort of like a romantic relationship with a very toxic relationship, but an inability to remove oneself from it, right? And so I'd had exposure to things like 12 steps. I had had exposure to going to see therapists and psychiatrists, but all of those attempts prior were really my heart wasn't in it. You know, I wanted the suffering to stop, but I wasn't able or willing to do the work necessary to rebuild my life because it takes some work to, you know, undo the wreckage of the past and to build a new thing. But after the ayahuasca experiences in 2009, I came to believe that my life was going to change. And so that I became very motivated. I had the willingness to do something different, and that had never existed before.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
What do you think the mm, what did psychedelics do? Like maybe let's get a little bit more granular.
okay.
What do you think psychedelics did to facilitate that to I mean, I've heard um someone describe their experience like they were a lifelong smoker and they knew they should quit and they knew intellectually they should quit and their doctors told them and their family told them and she was a mother and she had a child and it
Yeah.
was only with psychedelics that she then processed the knowledge and noetically is a term that I
Yes.
really like, right?
Yes.
It's like a felt knowledge instead
Yes.
of an intellectual one. And it was only after in a psychedelic trip, like her vision, for her, it visualized as her child seeing her dead body because she didn't finish smoking, she didn't quit smoking, and then she left the experience knowing in a felt way that something had to change, and that was the only way it could. She was the only way she was able to break the grip of addiction, despite knowing it here.
Absolutely. And this and the no the word noetic is a wonderful descriptor of my experience. So, or some might say, it's like an experiential knowledge as opposed to a theoretical knowledge. Things that I had learned or thought about or talked to therapists about. Truth is I liked going to see a therapist because I could kind of shoot the shit with them, right? Kind of
Hmm.
banter, but it didn't go anywhere below the neck. I needed my heart to feel, to come, to have that sense of noesis, like, oh, this can change. And for lack of a better word, it really is it's a spiritual experience. That shift in awareness, which was it, looking back, it was really small, but it was profound and utterly life-changing. It was kind of like all of a sudden I saw things slightly differently. I saw I knew what I'd been doing to myself. The evidence was all over my body. I mean, I had track marks on my jugular veins. You know, it's hard
Well,
to, be really in denial, but those early ayahuasca experiences, I I felt the love. I mean, it wasn't that my life was without love. I had lots of people that loved me. I managed to sort of alienate all of them or separate myself from them because of my own darkness and my own toxic presence. But I felt this great sense of love and a um, deep sense of hope. And
mm,
that's what came. And also the little insights. This is what I'm doing to myself. This is probably kind of like the smoker. And later, 2 years into my sobriety is actually when I stopped smoking cigarettes after an ayahuasca experience that showed me now it's time to deal with that very, uh, um, unhealthy practice, and which was secondary to my other addictions, but was also going to kill me if I didn't stop. And
mm,
it was a moment of clarity, like,
right.
this is what I'm doing. And I saw
Yeah.
the ugliness of it. And I
It,
saw the beauty that could replace it. And I
Okay.
and found, a sense of motivation, and I could commit myself to the change.
Yeah, beautiful. Uh, yeah,
Oh,
that's
let me there's one little one comment that I'm often asked about, so I'm gonna fill in the detail here. It's important to know that, I was addicted to things that are physically habit forming, and ayahuasca as a psychedelic doesn't help so much with the acute phase or the phase of acute physical detoxification from something
mm,
like heroin or alcohol or benzodiazepines. I had gone to jail for the last time in that spring of 2009, and that's where I physically detoxed from opiates and alcohol and benzodiazepines. The difference this time, I got out of jail in a state that some might call, like, stark raving sober.
mhm,
Like, very uncomfortable, physically clean, whatever that means, not dependent anymore, but really raw. But that then I was in a place where I could participate fruitfully in ayahuasca ceremonies.
mhm,
And then that there's a phenomenon or a syndrome that we call post-acute withdrawal syndrome that comes after the acute phase of detox is done, and then there's this long period of restlessness, depression, anxiety, rawness that lead many people to relapse. Well, the beauty for me, so I came in now, I was fresh, I was sitting with ayahuasca, and it helped me to bypass that whole post-acute withdrawal syndrome,
uh-huh,
literally
mhm.
on a neurochemical level. Something was happening. It was
Yeah.
seemed or that's what I'm
Replace withdrawal with an ayahuasca ceremony and, or use it to help you get through the withdrawal period. Yeah.
well, through the post-acute withdrawal.
Mm,
The acute withdrawal was actually in jail. That's like where you've got the shakes, you can't sleep, all of those other things that are characteristic of acute detoxification. But the very critical period right after that is post-acute, and that goes on for a couple of months where people often relapse in that period.
mhm.
And I say all that to say that of the psychedelic compounds, it is only ibogaine that has this kind of unique pharmacological ability to drastically diminish the experience of physical withdrawal from certain drugs,
Yeah, exactly.
which is, beautiful. Now, I didn't have access to ibogaine, nor would I have been able to afford it at that time, at that time, I didn't have a passport because I was a felon under the authority of the Office of Probation and Parole, so I couldn't
Right.
even leave the country if I
Yeah.
wanted to.
So yeah, so that's interesting. So ayahuasca doesn't necessarily have physical or neurochemical addictive relief, but somehow uh, it did lead you to addiction recovery. So yeah, so back to those moments that you mentioned you saw hope. You were given like you were yeah, and you were hopeful after. And maybe let's try to dig in a little bit to those moments. Like, what do you think the shift was from like a lifelong addiction of like the hardest drugs, and it was just some hope given to you? Did you it's like, for example, in on one ayahuasca ceremony with myself, and I saw what was going on inside me, and it was relatively mild to whatever was going on with you, but let's whatever. There's no hierarchy of suffering for the humans. And but I just saw what was happening inside me, and I felt bad for my from a third person. I saw myself, and I'm like, poor guy, poor kid. Like, look.
Compassion
Yeah,
well,
it was
com
compassion and a little bit of pity, and I'm like, like, "Why are you doing this to yourself?" And it was I still remember that moment. So, so I wonder what was your like, how did the shift happen? Was it just glorious, beautiful light, and then after, or yeah,
it
what was
had
going on within the
content.
ground?
It was that. It was a loving presence that some people call God, goddess, great spirit, great mystery, but it was a definite felt presence of love that allowed me to look at my life and the mistakes I had made. For instance, the collapse of the first love of my life, the first and the grief that came from that. Other area, that was very prominent, and to be able to revisit that and the person that I had been with and the dashed hopes and the profound sorrow that came as a result of losing that. Uh, Other areas of my life where I had maybe taken the wrong road, but the pervasive sense of compassion that all will be well. Like I was giving an opportunity for a new life.
Mm.
So it was in that loving presence that, when I use the word hope, that for the first time, I could envision my life drug and alcohol free. And not because I was trying to BS myself, like fake it till you make it or whatever. This was
Mm.
like, oh no, it became very clear that those residual, the heartaches, the mistakes, the guilt, shame, remorse, regret, all that stuff was like this, whatever this loving presence was like, it's all, your tears can be dried, your pains can be soothed. You now have the gift
Mm.
to go on and live a new life. And
Mm.
so what that inspired, interestingly, it for the first time I thought, wow, I'm going to go back to AA. And I'm going to, because I had read the books, and been around it. And for the first time, I saw that all of the principles, processes, and practices that are included in that particular spiritual recovery path and other recovery paths for that matter, I saw the beauty and power of what those practices and principles were. And I felt like, oh, I want to do this. And so for me, that was a dramatic shift, because if you would have asked me in years prior what I thought of recovery rooms, let me just say I held them in great contempt.
Mhm.
I felt, 12 steps were going to ask me to do things that I absolutely did not want to do.
Mhm.
Surrendering to a higher power. Well, if you're naturally agnostic, the whole idea is quite offensive.
Right.
The intense self-examination, the the making amends to others,
Mm.
restitution, basically trying to go fix things that I had broken required a certain level of humility that I didn't naturally possess. I didn't wanna do this. I didn't want to have to admit I was wrong on in so many areas. But after those experiences with ayahuasca, which was quite a series, um, I wanted to do that. And so
No.
I got involved in my local AA community, got a
No, no.
sponsor, started working through the steps with a great, vigor, and all of that was very different for me. Um, I at that time, I was living in my mom's basement. It's not an uncommon place for 42-year-old late-stage drug addicts and alcoholics to live if their family will still put up with them. But, her response was like, "Oh my god, I prayed for decades that something would help you, and here it's happening.
Mm.
You're like Lazarus, right? You've come
Mhm.
out of your tomb."
Yeah. So psychedelics allowed you to properly do recovery.
Yes.
You hadn't fully tried it. You were, happy like somehow to slip back into it. Like you had never given it the full go, and psychedelics allowed you to take that step. It's psychedelics opened your heart to the 12 steps.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
mhm, mhm.
And
And yeah, I guess I would say, mm, like what like were you cognizant of the pain you were like you've mentioned causing yourself pain, like deterioration of your body. Like you were cognitive. Like, why did you want to get clean? You're aware that you're causing your mom harm. Like the relate you mentioned, like the love, the regret of a lost love. Like what was the driving motivation that finally got you to take those steps?
Well, once I had this vision of myself and what I could be, and
Hmm.
that the persistent belief that I could not live without drugs and alcohol. Once I was able to reframe that, and those voices became quieter or even more kind of like small, and the other voice, the vision of my future, I was like all in. I went from a doubter to like a full believer almost overnight, as it were, which was quite striking, and that is where whatever doors were closed to me before, the lack of willingness, lack of hope, whatever, just profound, disillusionment, despair, and demoralization was now replaced with a sense of like, "Wow, I'm moving in a new direction now," and so it kind of unfolded somewhat effortlessly. I mean, there was work involved still, but I didn't have to be browbeat. My sponsor told me later at first, I didn't tell him about the ayahuasca, which is not surprising because I didn't wanna be chastised, right? And
Yeah.
it was like 4 months 3 months into my recovery is when I took step 5. If some of the listeners that are familiar with 12 steps will know what that is.
Hmm.
Uh, um,
What is it?
um, it confess to God, to ourselves, and another human being the exact nature of our wrongs, which is on step 4, made a fearless and thorough moral inventory of ourselves. And then step 5 is admitted, not confessed, admitted to God, to ourselves, and that other person who was my sponsor, the exact nature of all that stuff that was in my
Hmm.
moral inventory, which is a whole list of resentments, fear, conduct, sex conduct, all of the sort of the dark karmic baggage is on step 4, and then step 5, you actually share it with your sponsor and your higher power, however you think about that. Um, and so I got with the program, so to speak. I didn't lollygag, and so it's about 3 months, I took step 5, and it was after that, that I shared with my sponsor. I said, "Well, there's this other thing I've been doing. I've had the opportunity to sit in these shamanic, settings." And his response was not critical at all. It was like, "Well, something happened. Something happened from the guy who had track marks on his neck, and you were all of a sudden amenable and open to all of the things that we do in the rooms of recovery." And he said, "So, I'm gonna advise you never share this in an open meeting because it's not necessary, because it's just too controversial. It wouldn't be productive for a meeting, an open meeting." But he said, "I can see the results, and if those experiences helped you to get where you are, then, that's a good thing, because whatever
Hmm.
you were so, anyway, I wanted to say all that. So it's,
Yeah.
uh
Yeah, definitely. And so it seems that there's I don't say like a natural synergy between psychedelics and the ego dissolution and all the things that can come from psychedelics and some of the aspects of the 12-step program, like psychedelics can, like, taking those steps, especially the number 4 and 5 you mentioned, and I'm sure there's other ones. They require, a tearing down of internal walls and a
yes,
breaking down of the ego and just like a letting go, and a vulnerability. And psychedelics allowed you to step into the 12 steps, I guess.
yes,
Yeah. And did you like, as you started to take those steps, did you better like start to discover what it was like? I guess you knew for high level what you were doing wrong, what your problems were. I'm sure you could have named them, but as you started to speak them and as psychedelics allowed you to open up, did you see more? Did you understand why you went to the drugs? What was driving you on your internal, framework? Like what was driving you there? You discovered more as you were going through it?
There's
Yeah.
it's a continually unfolding process.
Mm,
So I learned more and more about myself and some of the things that motivated me, some of the things that were more subtle. I saw looking, because there's a lot of self-survey and historical survey that are involved in 12-step spiritual recovery of examining the past, seeking to uh, make amends for different aspects. But I was able to look back and see how my not just my curiosity, but how my intense pleasure seeking had eventually taken me to a place where it was no longer about seeking pleasure, it was to seek to avoid the pain that reckless pursuit of pleasure can bring. And I
mhm,
started to understand I could see my strengths as a person, but I could also see the liabilities that came with my personality, my, sometimes disguised, sometimes not disguised egotism, and how some of those things led me to not always value other people as highly as I should, even though even though I and sometimes I confused my I did have a I was kind of good-natured growing up, but there was a sort of subtle kind of egotism that came along with my good-naturedness that eventually overcame my good-naturedness, and it kind of degraded my personality. I got a chance to look at all this stuff without judgment of myself, but with the sense of like, "Oh, I can make improvements and adjustments here. I can, you know, learn to just be a human among humans, not better, not
mhm,
worse. Just another, like going back to the phrase we used at the beginning of the conversation, another member going through the human condition, another member of the human family,
mhm,
experiencing the human condition in my own, sort of unique personal way." And then, as the steps move along, it's really about the enlargement of the spiritual experience of life. Like we think of step 11 is sought through prayer and meditation to improve my conscious contact with God or higher power of my own understanding. And then ultimately, it's about service to others. Like, how can I contribute to the stream of life? And so we were talking about psychedelics being a catalytic aspect. And then this framework that the spiritual framework that the 12 steps bring allows those maybe epiphanies or peak experiences to become enduring,
mhm.
you
12
know.
steps is, integrating with the 12-step program.
Well, and then this is prior to the emergence or popularity of the term integration, right? I was 12 steps was a form of integration that was already s self-standing, right? And so when I started hearing I can't remember what year it was that I started hearing more about the term integration, and my thought and comment was always, "Oh, wow, there's all of these recovery programs that are already developed integration programs for psychedelic experiences."
Yeah. Yeah, seems
You
like
know?
it. Yeah. Uh, I was having a thought as you were speaking, like what got you there originally, and maybe just a quick thought on growing up. It seems like you have a slightly you're open to the spiritual aspect of things now. Like you'd mentioned that you were agnostic, and then now there's like a slight spiritual tone maybe to how you see things, even if it's not necessarily religious. And uh do you feel that that was what one of the things that was missing? And, growing up in the 80s, America at its kind of like hyper capitalist, materialistic peak, and a lot of the art and the culture around this was on the kind of, spiritual void on the inside. And, grunge music was around the corner trying to like address that cultural void. That's how I've always described the 90s counterculture, was like a reaction to the kind of vapidness of the 80s. And so, you mentioned the pleasure seeking, and so do you think that part of what got you there originally was a lack of a grounded?
Spirituality.
Yeah, that's it. You're happy to call it that? Yeah.
I mean, I think the I've come to believe that that we do have a spiritual core, that there is a certain spiritual hunger or desire for connection with something larger than ourselves. I think it however, I don't wanna speak of this in a religious way necessarily, although these days I do have religious beliefs now, but that was a gradual unfolding process. So it went from general spirituality into an actual I do have, religious practice that's formal. Um, but I think the unsatisfied, deep spiritual yearning that I had was part of was part of my problem. And I there's a Carl Jung once said something that addiction is can be thought of as the thirst of the soul for wholeness.
Mm,
So in other words, it's kind of like addiction is a failed spiritual quest.
mhm.
In the desire to satisfy that thirst or that yearning or longing for something bigger, connected not, to each other in the most deep, meaningful way, things that religion has historically provided, whether in prehistory or all the way through the millennia and centuries. Not having that core, like I said, curiosity is one thing, but it's sort of like you want to be a seeker, but sometime eventually you have to find at least something. You can't be endlessly seeking without ever finding anything, and or at least that was my experience. And you mentioned grunge. I lived in Seattle in the 90s. That's where my drug addiction started in 1985 in Seattle. And so I was in that era.
Well, at least you got some good concerts,
Yeah, what I did, yeah.
if you
Um,
remember them, if you remember any of them, but yeah.
yeah, I
Joking
I
around, yeah.
remember I was there.
Yeah.
Um,
I'm envious of that part. I mean, it must have been an interesting time, and it's a cultural shifting moment, and you were caught. I mean, like for people to be caught up. I mean that generation, your generation. I mean, check the overdose rates. I mean, there was a cultural shift that people in the West, people in North America, especially, had to like live through.
yeah,
We could say it was like first world problems, but they were real problems that we, as people who grew up in the kind of luxurious West, had to
yeah.
deal with this cultural shift, and a lot of it had to do with probably the shift away from religion, and suburban overconsumption and divorce, and the kind of all these things, and it led to like a
Alienation.
general, yeah, and like a cultural malaise that you felt personally, and that showed itself through cultural and the music and all that. Yeah.
Well, it's also interesting too, and going back to the there's a pleasure-seeking aspect, there's a design, the pleasure principle, the avoidance of pain principle, all these things are profound, human, programs. But one of the things I was also, I mentioned that I was part of, I was self-styled hippie. I believed in, although I lived in a grunge era, so I had a punk rock sensibility, I also, you know, was not necessarily a deadhead, but I was part of the Grateful Dead scene. There was a lot of psychedelics there. You could feel that there was, an attempt made in within hippie culture that I lived in to connect with that spiritual center within human beings. You could see that it was there, and this was a genuine reflection of that. But along with it, the in that sort of open-minded sort of live and let live, all is one, all is good. The heroin and cocaine were very prevalent or grew into the hippie culture that I was in and ruined it. Because they were a substantive departure from compounds such as LSD. MDMA was really big in the '80s too. The first wave of ecstasy was then. So that was there, mushrooms, LSD, cannabis, things that were less abusable and life capturing. But within a lot of that cohort, crack cocaine and heroin use made an invasion and cost the lives of many people that I knew and loved and respected.
Mhm. Yeah.
So even in the midst of something that was kind of like a spiritual revolution in a sense, I think some of the this is a little bit different than the grunge impulse, which was a reaction against the sort of vapidity of ever expanding suburbia and overconsumption within so I lived in two worlds, the sort of punk sensibility and in the hippie sensibility. Both were trying to do something,
Yeah.
but somehow
You say the
the
hard drugs you say the hard drugs kind of got in the way of that movement, and the
yeah.
movement yeah, it did. It kinda hijacked it.
And that is not, there's a historical precedent for that. I mean, late 60s was a time of great, there was great promise around maybe new ways of thinking about things, psychedelic experiences, lots of studies were being done. But then along with that came a lot of very self-destructive behavior, and we saw by the early '70s, massive rise in heroin use, crystal meth use, cocaine was emerging in the '70s, and so a lot of those phenomena started in the late '60s. The Summer of Love in San Francisco was kinda like the beginning of the end.
Yeah.
My friend Dave Smith, who is the founder of the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic, in 1967 has described in quite vivid detail what started happening in the Haight-Ashbury when crystal meth and heroin made inroads into the hippie populations and
Mhm.
caused a lot of havoc. So we saw this before, and my generation was just a little bit later, but we underwent the same problem. We fell for the same temptation,
Mm.
and a lot of people died,
Yeah.
you know?
Maybe it's a good segue, as we're winding down things over here, to speak about, psychedelics as a drug, potential for addiction, like all these things tied in. Like, how do you, like slightly shifting gears, how do you balance these two things as someone who's completely sober, as someone who, and as you said, you have to like deal with this paradox, psychedelics as a tool for recovery, although in recovery you're supposed to abstain. Like, how do you juggle these two realities of a substance, use of a substance being positive in the addiction community?
Well, for me, I think even going way back, I think it's recognized that the pharmacological properties of classic psychedelics do not lend themselves to addiction.
Correct. Yeah.
More technically speaking, they're not really very active in the dopaminergic reward pathway. Maybe somewhat. I'm not saying that there's no dopaminergic activity at all, but it pales in comparison to coke, meth, heroin, other
Mhm.
opioids, methamphetamine, alcohol for especially a certain subset of people where there's reinforcing properties. So for me, when I look at it, I understand that traditionally recovery is about abstinence. I have a modified view of that, obviously based on my own experience and my own recognition that classic psychedelics are not usually the things that lead people to lose control of their lives completely. That's usually other things.
Mhm.
So for me, but I do fairly clearly delineate the differences,
Mhm.
right? So, um, a classic psychedelics for me, when used carefully and thoughtfully, I think are perfectly acceptable. Um, and, I still probably sit in an ayahuasca ceremony maybe twice a year now, whereas early recovery was much more frequent because the fact is at that time I was a very sick person and I needed a lot of restructuring and a lot of the power that it could bring. So I do have still, um, periodic
Mhm.
ayahuasca ceremonies.
Right.
So I
And
support that.
yeah,
I
and
sup
you Sorry, do you have to have you done are you involved in kind of combating the stigma to create that delineation?
Oh, yeah.
Because as someone like I'm in psychedelics media and the psychedelics industry, and I often hesitate. Like I rarely use the word drugs, and I've had conversations about this, and some people want to take it back and own it, and I just think it's like an unnecessary blurring of the line, and I'd rather have a delineation between the
Yeah.
two. Do you see it that way too, especially if you're speaking to kind of communities that would be very sensitive to substances and the word drugs?
Yes.
Are you doing that kind of advocacy for psychedelics is not the same thing? This is something different.
I do. In fact, and I can share this here. In in 2015, I was one of a few people that helped to create a 12-step fellowship that is psychedelic friendly,
Mhm,
because we recognize the need for a forum where psychedelics could be discussed in the context of 12-step recovery without fear of recrimination. So,
mhm,
and so I'm part of a now an international fellowship called Psychedelics in Recovery that I was in the founding generation of that fellowship. Um, so I carefully sort of narrate how I view things and based on my own experience and that of other people that I have come to know that have benefited from psychedelics that are actually also just regular conventional members of recovery groups, conventional paths. And then, I do some work with Nikki Matani and Brian Anderson at UCSF, which looks at how 12 steps and psychedelics can be natural complements to one another, and the culling stories of people, looking at it sort of in an observational study kind of way. Um, m- m- my friend Dr. Nathan Sackett is at the University of Washington. He does work. He's the director of a center called the Center for Novel Therapeutics and Addiction Psychiatry, where they look at how psychedelics can be applied to a number of different problems, especially addictive disorders, right? And so the work that I do is being involved in academic projects like that, that seek to at least find more confirming evidence of the benefits of psychedelics to the addicted population, but also along the way, also being very careful to speak clearly about how they are different and making those distinctions fairly clear. And then also cautioning people about the risks of psychedelics for this population. And this is you'll have to forgive my little soapbox here. One of the downsides is that um, sometimes beliefs that are not true can emerge from psychedelic experiences with regard to addiction. It is not uncommon for a new person to come to believe that maybe somehow he has transcended the physical constraints of what addiction is. And so it would always be or to kind of engage in magical thinking. Addicts are given to magical thinking anyway. Psychedelics can certainly inspire magical thinking, but when it comes to deep primary conditions like addiction, I think it's always good to speak clearly about which beliefs that may arise may be false beliefs.
mhm. So
And not only
you step out of an addict goes to an ayahuasca ceremony, and he's like, "There it is. I'm done. I kicked it.
I'm done,
I'm
right?
done." Mm,
And then sometimes that pink cloud wears off,
mhm,
and then there's a return because the fact is severe addiction is deeply rooted. It's woven itself into our being at really core levels. Now, it's totally in remission and I don't live under a dark cloud of addiction. I can call myself an alcoholic. It doesn't mean I have a scarlet letter A on myself. It just means that my body has a certain response to the presence of alcohol. So I don't drink and I don't, but I live in a state of joy and effectiveness all the time. And here's another thing related to that. I've seen this happen. The ayahuasca cured my alcoholism. So therefore I can drink again.
mhm.
And now if you're a true alcoholic, that biochemical reaction to the presence of alcohol is probably never gonna reverse itself. It may
Mm,
leave you and be in total remission, but to come to believe that you may be able to drink like a gentleman again is misint is
yeah. So
is
there's
a
like
mi
the thing about, there's spiritual bypassing. I wonder if like psychedelics can provide a psychedelic bypassing, especially for addicts, or
they do.
the mind and the ego and the need. I feel it with my telephone. I mean, I'm just like I'll create I'll invent reasons that I need. I'm like, I'm gonna put it away for now because I know that I should. This is too much. I feel the addiction in my brain with the phone for sure. As someone that's a bit older, and I could track the difference in my brain, and
Mhm.
I'll catch my brain in just inventing any freaking reason to reach for it, right? And completely made up, and I rationalize it to myself, and I
Yeah.
say that excuse makes sense, and then I reach for it. And that's with the phone. I can't even imagine with with a chemical addiction. So, and if the addiction is so strong, sure, let it can grab a post ayahuasca enlightenment and twist it into whatever it needs to. You know, I,
Yes.
hmm
And I wanted to share this too. A beautiful thing for me being involved in a recovery community, even though I was having these profound experiences with ayahuasca, the recovery community reinforces the theme of humility, learning to see yourself just as another, and that helped. I think we've all recognized that there's an ego inflation that can occur with psychedelic experiences. It can be ego death or ego dissolving, but it can also fertilize the regrowth of the ego in different ways. It was very helpful for me to be in a community of people that reinforced the need to not be anything other than a garden variety drunk. Like, that was good. I that was left to my own devices, I could make a mess out of myself. And I think and this that reinforcement of humility, or the theme of humility at least. I'm not gonna say I don't have a natural tendency to humility, and maybe a lot of human beings don't, but at least I was given a model on how to understand that, and that was really good for my psychedelic experiences so that they wouldn't grow into something
hmm
unhealthy.
yeah. Um, But Todd, this has been really great, and I do think it's important. I mean, it's important work for yourself, for your community, but in general, for the addiction community and for the psychedelics community, the recovery community. Like, we have to give part of the work here of the idea of human journeys is to kind of create permission for people who are not necessarily psychedelic savvy and who aren't necessarily
Mm,
comfortable with it.
right,
And there may be people who are in need of recovery who don't w- who are really hesitant to go towards psychedelics, and
mhm,
although it could be very useful, could potentially save their lives, but they're not going there because
right.
of stigma, because of concerns. So, the destigmatization is, I think, important in general for psychedelics, but especially for the addiction and recovery community. So you're creating permission for people who may really need it. So it's important. So good
Yeah,
work.
and I'm really for me, I'm super grateful to be able to do that. Just to be able to express my experience in a way that someone might hear and be able to take some solace from or find some encouragement, right?
Hmm.
And to
Yeah.
live and to live and so I hope people can at least hear that message and then it helps them. And, my wife and I that's another benefit of being, sober is I got a chance to marry a sober alcoholic woman who's I have a great life with her now,
Hmm.
living in Port Townsend, Washington, and there's so many gifts that are available to us now, and so I hope that my message can at least inspire a seedling of hope in other people who might feel really hopeless.
Mm. Yeah. There's options out there for you.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. I mean, good work, and keep it up. And
Jason, I appreciate it so much. It's been really fun talking with you.